2 million logs. Let that sink in for a second. 2 million logs from 100 different timber companies, all floating together in the same river, tangled in a chaos of wood and water that stretched for miles. And the men who had to sort them, they walked on top of those floating logs with nothing but iron-tipped poles and their ability to read a mark carved into the end of a tree. This was the Pacific Northwest in the 1890s through the 1920s, and America's timber industry faced a problem that seemed impossible to solve. When you're cutting down thousands of acres of forest, and every logging company in the region is dumping their harvest into the same river system to float downstream to the mills, how do you tell one company's logs from another? How do you make sure that the timber you cut in the mountains 3 months ago doesn't end up in your competitor's mill pond 50 miles downstream? The solution required something that had never existed before, a system of identification so precise that a single man standing on a floating log could glance at a mark and know instantly which of 100 companies owned that particular piece of timber. But creating that system would demand the registration of more than 2,000 unique brands, an army of workers willing to risk their lives every single day, and a level of organization that rivaled anything the industrial age had produced. Could Americans really build a sorting operation in the middle of a river that could handle 2 million logs a year without losing track of a single one? Before we get to how they solved it, you need to understand just how insane the whole operation was from the start. Imagine standing at the confluence of the Columbia River and one of its tributaries in 1905. The water is moving fast, not gentle, not peaceful, fast. And covering the surface of that river, as far as you can see in both directions, are logs. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. They're not lined up neatly. They're not organized. They're just there. A churning mass of 40-foot-long timbers, each one weighing between 2 and 4 tons, all of them jostling against each other, spinning, colliding, some of them standing vertical in the water like drowned telephone poles. Every single one of those logs came from a different location. Some were cut 200 miles upstream. Some were cut 20 miles away. Some have been floating for 2 weeks. Some have been in the water for 3 months, and every single one belongs to someone. The Weyerhaeuser Company, the Puget Mill Company, the Pope and Talbot Mill, the St. Paul and Tacoma Lumber Company, dozens of operations, all using the same river, all depending on getting their timber to their mills. And at some point, all of those logs are going to arrive at a sorting works where men will have to separate them by owner and send each company's timber to the right destination. The first attempts to manage this were disasters. In the 1870s and early 1880s, timber companies tried to keep their logs separate by controlling when they released them into the river. Your company would cut through the winter, stack your logs by the riverbank, and when spring came and the water ran high from snowmelt, you'd roll everything into the river in one massive push and try to keep your logs together as they floated downstream. It didn't work. The river didn't care about your schedule. One company's logs would catch up to another's. Log jams would form. Tens of thousands of dollars worth of timber would pile up in narrow canyons, creating dams that could take weeks to break apart. And even when the logs made it through, there was no way to tell one man's timber from another's once they reached the mill. Some companies tried painting their logs. That lasted about a month before everyone realized that paint doesn't survive being bashed against rocks and other logs for 50 miles. Others tried tying their logs together into rafts, but a raft that works in calm water becomes a battering ram in fast current, and the ropes would break, unscattering the logs anyway. By 1885, it was clear that if the timber industry was going to use rivers for transport, they needed something permanent, something that couldn't wash off or break loose, something that would survive the journey and still be readable at the end. The answer came from an industry that had been marking ownership for thousands of years. Ranchers branded their cattle to prove ownership on the open range. Why not brand logs? But here's where it gets interesting. A rancher might need one brand, maybe two if he ran separate herds in different territories. The timber industry in the Pacific Northwest needed thousands. Every company, every contractor, every independent logging operation that floated timber down a river needed a unique registered mark that no one else could use. And someone had to keep track of all of them. In 1889, the state of Washington passed the first log branding law. It required every person or company that put logs in a river to register a unique brand with the state. The brand had to be stamped or carved into the end of each log. It had to be clear enough to read. It had to be different from every other registered brand. And it had to be renewed annually. Oregon followed with a similar law in 1893. By 1900, the states were registering more than 2,000 unique log brands. The brands themselves were works of brutal simplicity. Some were letters, some were numbers, most were symbols. A circle with a line through it, a double anchor, 3 triangles stacked, a diamond with a cross inside, an inverted horseshoe. These weren't decorative, they were functional. They had to be something a man could identify at a glance while standing on a moving log in rough water. They had to be distinct enough that even worn or damaged they could still be read, and they had to be impossible to alter or forge. The creativity in brand design was remarkable when you consider the constraints. The Weyerhaeuser Timber Company used a simple W with a triangle underneath. Pope and Talbot used a distinctive anchor with the letters P and T on either side. The St. Paul and Tacoma Lumber Company registered a brand that looked like a railroad crossing sign. 2 lines crossing at an angle with circles at each end. Some smaller operators got more creative. There was a logger named Gustav Nordstrom who registered a brand that was 3 interlinked circles arranged like a Celtic knot. There was another operator whose brand was a perfect 5-pointed star with the number 7 inside it. Each brand was legally protected. If you used someone else's brand, even by accident, you could be prosecuted for timber theft. The registration process was surprisingly bureaucratic for something involving men who worked in the woods. You'd submit an application to the state timber commissioner's office with a drawing of your proposed brand. The office would check it against all existing brands to make sure it was sufficiently different. The rule was that your brand had to be distinct enough that it couldn't be confused with any other brand, even if it was partially damaged or obscured. If your brand was too similar to an existing one, your application would be rejected and you'd have to submit a new design. Once approved, you'd pay a registration fee, $5 initially, which was about $150 in today's money, and your brand would be added to the official registry. The brand stamps themselves were custom made by blacksmiths or specialized stamp makers. The face of the stamp was the inverse of the brand design, cut in relief so it would leave an impression when hammered into wood. The metal had to be hard enough not to deform with repeated use, but not so brittle that it would crack. Most were made from tool steel. The handles were hardwood, usually hickory or ash, about 2 feet long to give leverage when swinging the sledgehammer. A good brand stamp cost between $10 and $20, $300 to $600 in modern currency. And a large logging operation might own a dozen of them so they could have branding stations at multiple cutting sites. The branding was done in the woods, right after the tree was cut. A crew would fell a tree, saw it into 40-foot sections, and before they moved it to the river, a brander would stamp each end with the company mark. The stamps themselves were massive. Some were 18 inches across. They were driven into the wood with sledgehammers, leaving an impression an inch deep. On softer woods like cedar or fir, the brand would sink in clean and sharp. On harder woods, you might have to hit it a dozen times to get a clear mark. Every log got branded on both ends. That way, if one end got damaged during the float, the other end would still show ownership. Now here's the thing that separated that generation from ours. These brands weren't just for show, they were legally binding proof of ownership. If you found a log with someone else's brand on it in your mill pond, that wasn't your log. It didn't matter that it was physically on your property. It didn't matter that you'd paid to operate the sorting works. That log belonged to whoever owned that brand, and taking it was theft. The courts upheld this. There are documented cases of mill owners being prosecuted for processing logs that carried someone else's mark. But having 2,000 registered brands was only half the solution. The other half was figuring out how to actually sort 2 million logs floating in a river, and that's where the boom came in. A log boom was a floating barrier made of logs chained together end to end. The logs used for the boom were usually old-growth timber, 40 to 60 feet long, sometimes bigger. They were chained together with heavy iron links, creating a continuous barrier that could be anchored in place or adjusted by moving the anchor points. A single boom could be a quarter-mile long. The big sorting operations used multiple booms arranged in a fan pattern, creating channels that directed logs to different holding areas based on their brands. The engineering of a boom system was more sophisticated than it appeared. The main boom had to be strong enough to stop thousands of tons of logs, but flexible enough to handle changes in water level and current. During spring runoff, a river might rise 10 or 15 feet in a week, which meant the boom anchors had to be adjustable. Most operations used a combination of fixed anchors set into the riverbank or bedrock and floating anchors made of heavy logs weighted down with rocks or scrap iron. The chains connecting the boom logs were massive. Each link was 2 inches thick and weighed about 20 pounds. A quarter-mile boom might use 100 tons of chain. The arrangement of the sorting channels required careful planning. You couldn't just point logs in random directions and hope they'd end up in the right place. The channels had to account for current direction, water velocity, and the natural tendency of logs to spin and drift. The best boom designs created a gradual funnel system where logs would be slowed down by the main boom, sorted into primary channels based on broad categories. Say, it's all Weyerhaeuser brands in one channel, all independent loggers in another, and then sorted again into secondary channels for final placement. A large sorting works might have 30 or 40 separate holding booms, each one containing logs from a specific company or group of companies. The boom boats were essential to the operation. These were small tugboats, usually 20 to 30 feet long, powered by gasoline or diesel engines. Their job was to move the holding booms, adjust the sorting channels, and rescue logs that got stuck or went astray. A boom boat operator needed to know the river intimately, where the deep channels were, where the current ran fastest, where sandbars or rock formations might catch a wayward log. During peak season, sorting works might run 4 or 5 boom boats continuously, on each one covering a different section of the operation. The way it worked was this: logs would float downstream and hit the main boom. The boom would stop them. They'd pile up against it, creating a massive raft of loose timber. Then the boom men would go to work. A boom man's job was to walk out onto that floating mass of logs, read the brands on the ends, and use a pike pole to push each log toward the correct channel. If you were sorting for 20 different mills, you had 20 different channels, each one leading to a different holding boom. You'd read a brand, recognize it instantly, and decide which way that log needed to go. Then you jam your pike pole into the end of the log and lever it toward the right channel. One log at a time, thousands of times a day. Let me be very clear about what this actually meant. You were standing on logs that were floating in water, not standing on solid ground next to the water, standing on the logs themselves. The logs were not stable. They rolled, they shifted, they spun. When you stepped on one, it would tilt. When you pushed on one with your pike pole, it would move away from you, and you'd have to adjust your footing on whatever log you were standing on. And you were doing this in a river that was moving, sometimes slowly, sometimes fast enough that if you fell in, you'd be swept 100 yards downstream before you could grab hold of anything. The tools were simple: a pike pole. That's it. A pike pole was a wooden shaft, anywhere from 6 to 12 feet long, with a steel spike and hook on the end. You jam the spike into a log to get purchase. Then use the leverage to push or pull that log in the direction you needed it to go. A 4-ton log doesn't move easy, even in water, so you were using your entire body weight against that pole, pushing with your legs, pulling with your back, all while balancing on a surface that was trying to roll you off into the water. The best boom men could read brands from 20 feet away and could sort logs as fast as the river delivered them. They developed a rhythm: step onto a log, read the brand, jam the pike, push, move to the next log, read, push, move, hour after hour. Some of the big operations ran 24 hours a day during peak season, with crews rotating in shifts. You'd work 6 hours, come off the boom soaked and exhausted, and another crew would take over. But here's what made it truly difficult. The brands weren't always easy to read. A log that's been in the water for 3 months gets waterlogged. The surface swells. The brand gets fainter. If the end of the log got damaged during the float, hit a rock, got crushed in a log jam, the brand might be partially obliterated, and you had to make the call anyway. You had to look at a damaged brand and figure out what it was supposed to be based on what was left. Was that a circle with a line through it, or was it a circle with two lines? Was that an anchor, or was it something else? Get it wrong, and you've just sent someone's log to the wrong mill. Get it right, and the system works. The experienced men developed an almost supernatural ability to identify brands. They memorized all 2,000 of them. They could tell you which brand belonged to which company. They knew the variations. Some companies had multiple brands for different operations or different cutting areas. The boom men knew them all. They had to. Because unlike working in a warehouse where you can double-check a label or ask for help, you were standing on a floating log in moving water with 100 more logs coming at you, and you had to make the decision in seconds. And there was no margin for error. The timber industry ran on tight margins. A big mill might process 200,000 board feet of lumber a day, and if the wrong log showed up, if someone else's timber got mixed into your operation, the entire system would grind to a halt while you sorted out who owned what. The sorting booms prevented that. They were the control point, the place where chaos became order. Now let's talk about the danger. Because this wasn't filing paperwork in an office. This was one of the most dangerous jobs in American industry. The primary hazard was obvious. You could fall in the water, and falling in the water when you're surrounded by thousands of floating logs meant you could very easily get crushed. A man in the water is small. A log weighing 4 tons doesn't stop just because there's a person in its way. If 2 logs came together while you were between them, it didn't matter how strong you were going to get squeezed. And the river kept moving, kept pushing logs into each other, kept creating gaps that would close without warning. The old-timers would tell you that the worst part wasn't the fear of drowning. It was the fear of getting trapped under the logs. Because if you fell and went under the surface and logs closed over you, you were essentially underneath a solid wooden roof. You couldn't surface. You couldn't breathe. You'd be pushed downstream by the current, scraping along the underside of the logs, trying to find a gap, trying to get your head above water. Some men made it, some didn't. There are accounts, terrible accounts, that the old-timers would tell in hushed voices of boom men who fell in and were never seen again. They'd just vanish into the mass of logs. The crew would search. They'd use pike poles to try to push logs apart and create gaps. They'd work downstream, checking the banks. Sometimes they'd find the body a mile away, wedged between logs or caught in shallow water. Sometimes they wouldn't find anything at all. Peter Svensson was one of the ones they found. May 1907, Columbia River near Kalama. Svensson was working the main boom when a log rolled unexpectedly. He lost his footing, went into the water, and disappeared under the logs. The crew got to him within 3 minutes. They pushed apart enough logs to create a gap and pulled him out. He'd been underwater less than 5 minutes. But it was enough. His lungs had filled with water trying to breathe in the gaps between logs. He died on the riverbank while they were trying to pump the water out of him. He was 24 years old. His widow received $90 from the logging company, 3 months' pay, and a letter expressing their regrets. Or take the case of Frank Delacroix, a French-Canadian who'd worked the booms in Maine before coming west. Delacroix survived 11 years on the Columbia River sorting works without a serious injury. Then in April 1913, he was working during high water. The river was running 8 feet higher than normal, moving fast, churning with debris. A log came through that had a branch stub still attached, a spear of wood about 2 feet long sticking out from the side. That branch caught Delacroix in the chest as the log spun past him, punched right through his ribs. His crew got him off the boom and to shore, but there wasn't a doctor within 20 miles, and even if there had been, there wasn't much that could be done for a punctured lung in 1913. He died that night in the bunkhouse. The company carved his name into a wooden marker and buried him in the camp cemetery. 5 years later, when they closed that particular sorting works, someone moved the graves to a proper cemetery in town. Delacroix's name is still there on the stone, and went along with the dates and the words, "Killed in service." Then there was the equipment danger. Pike poles weren't toys. The steel spike on the end was sharp enough to punch through wood. It could punch through flesh just as easy. If you slipped while pushing a log and fell forward onto your pike pole, that spike could go through your chest. It happened. Not often, but it happened. And when it did, there wasn't much anyone could do. You were out in the middle of a river on a raft of loose logs, miles from medical help. The logs themselves were killers in ways you wouldn't expect. When a log rolled unexpectedly, it could slam into you. A 40-foot log spinning in the water has momentum. If it caught you in the legs, it could break both your femurs before you even registered what happened. If it hit you in the torso, it could crush ribs, rupture organs, and because you were standing on other logs that were also moving, you couldn't just jump out of the way. Your footing was unstable. Your balance was precarious. When a log came at you, your options were limited. Weather added another layer of danger. In the Pacific Northwest, the sorting season coincided with the spring runoff, which meant cold water. Hypothermia cold. If you fell in during March or April, you had maybe 15 minutes before the cold started shutting down your body. Your muscles would stop responding, your fingers wouldn't grip the pike pole, your legs wouldn't kick. And even if your crew got you out of the water, if you'd been in too long, you were done. Hypothermia doesn't reverse itself just because you're out of the water. You'd be wrapped in blankets and taken to the bunkhouse, and sometimes you'd recover, sometimes you wouldn't. The fatality numbers are hard to pin down because record keeping was inconsistent, but camp ledgers and newspaper reports suggest that boom work killed somewhere between 2 and 5% of the men who did it long term. That's not per year. That's overall. If you worked the booms for 20 years, you had a 1 in 20 to 1 in 50 chance of dying on the job. Those are better odds than some mining operations or high-altitude timber work, but they're not good odds. But men did it anyway. Why? Because it paid. A boom man in 1905 made about $3 a day. That's roughly $85 in today's money, and that was for 6 hours of work. Do 2 shifts, and you could make $6 in a day, which was more than most factory workers made in a week. The best boom men, the ones who could work the fastest and sort the most accurately, could make $4 or $5 a shift during peak season. That's the equivalent of pulling down $150 a day in modern currency. It wasn't easy money, but it was good money. And for men who grew up in logging camps or on the water, the danger was just part of the job. The camps themselves were rough. Most sorting operations ran temporary facilities near the boom sites. These weren't towns. They were collections of bunkhouses, cook shacks, and equipment sheds. The bunkhouses were long wooden buildings with rows of bunks, each man getting a narrow bed and a footlocker. The smell was a mixture of wet wool, tobacco smoke, and the accumulated human existence of 50 men living in close quarters. Ventilation was minimal. Heat came from wood stoves. Like in the summer, the buildings were stifling. In the spring, they were damp and cold. Food was basic but abundant. The cook shack served 3 meals a day, and the portions were massive because the men were burning 4,000 or 5,000 calories a shift. Breakfast was pancakes, bacon, eggs, and coffee. Lunch was stew, bread, and more coffee. Dinner was meat, potatoes, bread, and whatever vegetables could be sourced. It was fuel. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough to keep a man working. Off shift, there wasn't much to do. Some men played cards, some men drank, though most camps had strict rules against alcohol on site. Some men just slept. The work was so physically demanding that your body needed the rest. You'd come off a shift, eat, and collapse into your bunk for 6 hours before the next shift started. That was the routine. Day after day, week after week, the season usually ran from March through June, when the snow melt kept the rivers high and the logs moving. But the boom men weren't just muscle. They were the keepers of an incredibly complex system. To understand how complex, consider this. By 1910, there were over 3,000 registered log brands in Washington and Oregon combined. That's 3,000 unique marks, each one representing a different timber company or contractor. And the boom men had to know them, not just the major brands, all of them. Because a small independent logger who only put a few hundred logs in the river each year still had a registered brand, and his logs still had to be sorted correctly. The state published brand books. These were thick volumes, hundreds of pages long, that listed every registered brand along with the name and address of the owner. The books were distributed to sorting operations, and new boom men were expected to study them. You'd sit in the bunkhouse with the brand book open, memorizing marks, circle, diamond, anchor, cross, bar, double bar, triangle, inverted triangle, square, octagon, and every possible combination. Circle with a bar, circle with two bars, circle with a cross, circle with a diamond inside. On and on. The really good boom men could do something remarkable. They could look at a brand and tell you not just who owned it, but where the timber probably came from. Because they knew the geography. They knew that certain brands belonged to companies that only operated in certain watersheds. If you saw a particular brand, you knew that log came from the upper Snoqualmie River drainage, which meant it had been in the water for at least 3 weeks, which meant it was probably more waterlogged than logs from closer operations. That knowledge affected how you handled it. A waterlogged log sits lower in the water and moves differently than a fresh log. The boom men understood this. They could read the water, read the brand, and adjust their technique accordingly. There was a hierarchy in the boom crews. At the bottom were the greenhorns, the new men who were just learning the brands and the footwork. They worked the easier sections of the boom, where the logs came through slower and the sorting was less critical. Above them were the regular boom men, the guys who had a season or two under their belts and could handle the main flow. One at the top were the head boom men, the veterans who'd been doing this for 10 or 15 years and could work the most difficult sections, the spots where multiple channels converged, where the current was fastest, where the sorting had to be perfect because there was no second chance. The head boom men were almost mythical figures in the camps. Men like Olaf Henriksen, a Norwegian immigrant who worked the booms on the Columbia River for 18 years without a serious injury. Henriksen was known for his ability to work in conditions that would shut down other crews. High water, fast current, logs coming through so thick that there was barely space between them. He'd be out there, pike pole in hand, sorting 300 logs an hour, never missing a brand. Or Jack McLeod, a Scotsman who worked the sorting booms in Oregon and who was said to have memorized every brand in the state. Men would test him. They'd carve a fake brand into a scrap of wood and show it to him, and McLeod would tell them it wasn't registered and name the 3 closest brands it resembled. These men didn't just know the job, they were the job. They trained the new workers, they maintained the discipline, they made the split-second decisions when things went wrong. And when a man fell in the water, it was usually a head boom man who went in after him. By 1920, the log sorting industry was operating at a scale that would have been unimaginable 30 years earlier. The big sorting works on the Columbia River were handling over 2 million logs a year. 2 million, each one branded, each one sorted, each one sent to the correct destination. The system worked so well that timber companies could cut trees 100 miles from their mills and have complete confidence that their logs would arrive at the right place. To put that number in perspective, 2 million logs at an average of 3 tons per log meant 6 million tons of timber moving through the sorting system annually. That's 12 billion pounds of wood. The sorting operations processed roughly 5,500 logs per day during peak season, which meant that boom men were handling about 9 logs per minute during a 6-hour shift. Every single one had to be read, identified, and directed to the correct channel. The record-keeping alone was a massive undertaking. So each sorting works employed scalers, men whose job was to count and measure the logs as they were sorted. A scaler would stand at each channel with a tally book and a measuring tape, recording every log that went through. They'd note the brand, estimate the board footage based on the diameter and length, and keep running totals for each company. At the end of the day, the scalers would compile their numbers and submit reports to the sorting works manager, who would then bill each timber company for their share of the sorting costs. The sorting fee was typically 10 to 15 cents per 1,000 board feet, roughly $4 per log in modern money. That might not sound like much, but multiply it by 2 million logs, and you're looking at $8 million a year in sorting fees. The economic impact was staggering. The sorting system made it possible for multiple companies to share the same river infrastructure, which drove down costs for everyone. A small operator who might only cut a few thousand logs a year didn't need to build his own transportation system. He could brand his logs, dump them in the river, and know they'd be sorted out downstream. That opened up timber tracts that had previously been uneconomical to harvest. It allowed the industry to expand into remote areas. It turned logging from a localized industry into a regional powerhouse. Consider the numbers. Before the sorting boom system was established, a small logging operation needed a timber tract within 10 miles of a mill to be profitable. But with river transport and sorting booms, that same operator could harvest timber 50 or even 100 miles from a mill and still make money. This meant that vast stretches of forest that had been considered inaccessible suddenly became valuable. Land that had been selling for $5 an acre in 1885 was going for $50 an acre by 1900. The sorting system didn't just move logs, it unlocked capital. The state governments benefited enormously. Washington and Oregon both taxed timber based on volume harvested, and the sorting system made accurate taxation possible. Tax revenue from timber jumped from a few $100,000 a year in the 1890s to several $1 million a year by 1915. That money funded roads, schools, and infrastructure throughout the region. The sorting booms also created secondary jobs. You needed boom tenders to maintain the chain link booms and adjust them as water levels changed. You needed boom boat operators to run small tugboats that helped move logs between holding areas. You needed scalers, men who measured and tallied the logs as they were sorted, keeping official counts for each company. You needed brand inspectors, state employees who checked to make sure the sorting was being done correctly, and that no one was diverting logs to the wrong mills. A major sorting works might employ 150 men during peak season, but it wasn't going to last. The thing that killed the sorting boom system wasn't competition or obsolescence, it was trucks. In the 1920s, logging trucks started appearing in the Northwest. At first they were primitive. Solid rubber tires, no power steering, marginal brakes. But they could do something rivers couldn't. They could take timber directly from the cutting site to the mill without waiting for spring runoff. They didn't require brands, they didn't require sorting. You cut the tree, loaded it on a truck, and drove it to your mill. Simple, fast, efficient. The transition wasn't immediate. Rivers were still cheaper for long-distance transport through the 1930s, and many operations continued to use the boom system. But by the 1940s, the economics had shifted. Truck capacity increased. Roads improved. Diesel engines replaced gasoline engines, giving trucks more power and better fuel economy. And most importantly, the old-growth timber close to rivers was running out. The new cutting was happening in areas that didn't have good river access, which meant trucks were the only option. The last major log sorting operation on the Columbia River closed in 1972. There were a few smaller operations that lasted into the 1980s, but they were handling specialty timber or serving niche markets. The era of the boom men was over. The registration of log brands continued for a while out of legal necessity. There were still some logs floating around that needed to be identified, but by 1990, the states had stopped actively enforcing the brand laws. The brand books were archived, the stamps were sold as scrap metal or donated to museums, the booms themselves were dismantled and either burned or left to rot on riverbanks. Today, if you know where to look, you can still see traces of the boom system. On the Columbia River near Longview, Washington, and there's a stretch of waterfront where the anchor points for the old sorting booms are still visible. They're massive iron rings set into concrete piers. Each ring is 2 feet in diameter. They're corroded now, covered in moss and river debris, but they're still there. You can stand next to them and imagine what it was like when those rings held chains that controlled the movement of 2 million logs. There are museum collections that have preserved some of the brand stamps. The Whitman County Museum in Washington has about 40 of them on display. You can see the variety. Some are simple geometric shapes. Others are elaborate combinations of letters and symbols. Each one represents a company that no longer exists, a piece of timber empire that's now just a mark in a record book. A few of the log brands have survived in a different form. Some old logging companies that are still in business kept their historic brands as logos or trademarks. You'll see them on letterheads or building signs, and most people have no idea that the symbol they're looking at was once hammered into the end of 1 million logs floating down a river. The boom men themselves are gone now. The last of them would have been born in the 1910s. which means they've been dead for 20 or 30 years. But the stories remain. In the small towns along the Columbia and the Willamette rivers, you'll occasionally meet someone whose grandfather or great-grandfather worked the booms. They'll tell you about the old man's hands, how they were scarred from splinters and pike poles, how he could still identify log brands 50 years after he'd stopped working. They'll tell you about the respect that boom men commanded in those communities, how they were seen as tough, competent, essential. What we've lost in the shift from rivers to roads, from brands to bills of lading, from men balancing on logs to men driving trucks, is a certain kind of physical intelligence. The boom men possessed a skill that combined knowledge, balance, strength, and split-second judgment in a way that you don't see much anymore. They existed in a space between the natural world and the industrial world, using simple tools to solve a complex problem, working in conditions that would terrify most modern people. There's something humbling about that. We live in an age where we track shipping containers with GPS and satellites, where a computer can tell you the exact location of any piece of freight anywhere in the world at any time. And that's progress. That's good. But it's worth remembering that 90 years ago, men accomplished something equally impressive with nothing but carved marks, chains, and the ability to walk on water that wasn't frozen. They sorted 2 million logs a year. They did it by hand. They did it in rivers, and they almost never made a mistake. The sorting booms were more than just an industrial system. They were a testament to what people could organize when they had to. 2,000 brands, 2 million logs, 1 river, and it worked. Not because of machines, not because of automation, because of men who learned the brands, mastered the footwork, and spent their days walking on floating timber, or making sure that every piece of the forest went to the right place. If you know someone who worked the booms, if you have family stories from the logging era, if you remember the old brand stamps hanging in a barn somewhere, those stories matter. They're a window into a version of America that was louder, harder, and more dangerous than what we have now. But it was also a time when the relationship between work and reward was more direct, when skill was visible, when the difference between a good worker and a great worker was immediately obvious to anyone watching. The rivers still flow. The logs are gone, the brands are archived, the boom men are buried in small-town cemeteries along the river valleys. But the system they built, the improbable sorting operation that turned chaos into order, that solved an impossible problem with nothing but chains and knowledge and nerve, that deserves to be remembered. Not because it was perfect, because it was real, and because the people who made it work were remarkable.